So this is so great. I am so happy. I was asked to make an announcement. So Thursday, March 14th is PSC Contract Unity Day. There's a wake-up call rally at Governor Cuomo's New York City office at 8 a.m. And then there's a press conference and rally at 11 a.m. So if you care about CUNY and accessible, quality public education, try to be there. So I'll pass this around. I guess I should first say thanks to Stephanie for such a great introduction. I've been at CUNY for 6.5 years now, I think, and there's a lot of really great things about working here. But having, one of the best is working alongside such a kind of stellar faculty and having great colleagues. So thank you so much. I should also say thanks to Michael Lalonde, Samantha Valente, Paula Finn, and Aaron Lechner, who are all part of the Center for Labor and Community and Public Policy here at CUNY SLU. Putting on an event like this, although it might not seem like it, requires a lot of logistical skills that I lack, and that became very apparent going through this. So thank you so much for shepherding me through this whole process. And if this is your first time at one of these events, don't let it be your last. We would love that you come back to the many events that we put on here. I'd also like to thank Eric, Professor Eric Goldwyn, for first reading the book, and second for coming here and being willing to talk to me and all of us about what it's about and if it's any good, and so thanks. I should also point out that Eric used to teach here, and so and we've talked about transit a lot, and so some of the ideas that come through in the book, were developed in conversation with him and many other people. So thank. It's very generous. So thanks for that. Lastly, I'd like to shine a spotlight on Jimmy James Green, whose art graces the cover of the piece. We're encouraged, I think, to not judge books by their cover, but that's totally fine. You can totally judge it by its cover. So, not only is Jimmy James a talented artist, he actually happens to be my cousin. So it's nice to be able to keep it in the family. The book itself. So I actually had the chance to reread the book yesterday in preparation for this whole thing, and I was pleasantly surprised. It's actually really good. I think it's well written. It's very accessible, and I think it makes some very important arguments and very timely arguments. One of the fears that academic writers have is that given the glacial pace of academic publishing, there's the lag time between when you actually do the research, like when you interview people and when you go into the archives, and then when the final thing shows up, it's so long that you fear that it's not going to be relevant anymore. So what's and especially now, given the kind of like the pace of our world. So, in my case, the research that went into this book, a lot of the interviews were conducted in 2009 or 2010, which feels like 100 years ago. So, but what's interesting is that I think, the arguments I advance in the book are probably actually more relevant now than they would have been 2 or 3 years ago, which I guess it's just luck of the draw. So what am I arguing? What am I saying? So the book is about public transportation, the relationship between public transportation and rights, and it explores that relationship in the context of California's East Bay, Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda. But the argument I make in the book is actually much broader, and I think extends to any number of other contexts outside the East Bay. And that argument is more or less threefold. The first argument is simply a defense of rights talk, that is, in talking in terms of rights, and framing urban public transit in explicitly rights terms. So the book actually opens with a quote from a bus rider, an Oakland-based bus rider named Karen Smolovitz. And the context for the quote is important. So this is 2010. AC Transit, which is the main transit provider in the East Bay, is in a crisis. They are proposing slashing service for the third time in 1 year. We are in a boardroom in which kind of the board of directors for the transit agency are about to vote on these cuts. The room is packed to the gills, with angry bus drivers who are kind of like, what's going to happen? And so there's a public comment period, which is really like, it opens the floodgates, really. So just the rancor and anger just comes spewing out. And in the public comment period, Karen stands up and says this: of all the civil rights that exist, whether it is food security, housing, healthcare, or education, the right to transportation is the most integral to each. The ability to get to those things, or the right to get to those things. So the first argument of the book is basically, yeah, Karen's right. we listen to Karen. And that rights allow us to not only talk about transit in like political terms, but also explicitly moral terms. And there's no better evidence of why this kind of matters than if you go to the American Public Transportation Association site. You can do it, after this event. And there's a little tab that has reports, and you could just go to the reports, and it's like the business case for transit investment, public transit in the knowledge economy, the economic impact of transit investment on real estate. And it's just report after report after report on this kind of, it's understandable, but this kind of functionalist, econometric kind of assessment of transit that sort of misses the Karen Smolevitzes of the world, and it misses the experience of any number of other people who are condemned by poverty or because they want to use public transit, to use transit in ways that are just and equitable. So to start with rights is to say that transit is important for so many other reasons, essential to our democratic public life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's almost, transit is a promise. I know that's kind of cheesy, but it's a promise that says that, if you are too poor or have a disability and can't get around, that you can still access the city and all the resources in the city. And it's really important to frame transit in those ways. That's the reality. Okay, so that's the first argument. There's two more, and they're connected. So the second argument is basically like that there's different ways to talk about rights. There's a dizzying array of rights, types of rights and rights claims, socioeconomic rights, positive rights, negative rights. All the students I have in my class are nodding, because we just talked about this. Liberty rights, claim rights, and all the kind of corresponding duties that kind of rights claims elicit. So one of the book's observations is that, much of the literature on transportation justice and transportation equity has almost exclusively focused on questions of civil rights. And that, in many ways, that's understandable. It's understandable given the history of our country and the history of struggles around transit. One only has to think about the kind of civil rights struggles in the American South with the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, or the bus boycott in New Orleans 4 years before that. You can think about the struggles of ADAPT, Americans with Disabilities for Accessible Transit, in the late 1970s after the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, where people in wheelchairs were literally throwing themselves in front of buses to get wheelchair lifts on them. And I mean, their goal was in many ways the extension of civil rights to a minority group, people with disabilities. There's also kind of more contemporary examples that some of you might be familiar with, one of which is the success of the Los Angeles Bus Riders Union in the mid-1990s after they won a consent decree against the Los Angeles MTA for violating the civil rights of minority riders. So this is all very important, all, very essential to kind of how we understand rights with respect to transit. But the book makes yet an argument on top of this, or it extends this argument yet further. And it says that there's a desperate need to think as much about civil rights in transit as it is to think about the more radical notion of the right to the city. And I'll spend some time kind of distinguishing these two. So what is this? So what does it mean to talk about the right to the city, which Stephanie alluded to? Well, first it means offering an almost explicit critique of the political economy of cities and how cities are governed, and the relationship between the governance of cities and the power in many ways of real estate, of corporate interests, of the moneyed elite in many ways, to put it in very crass terms, and that to think about the right to the city puts an emphasis on the kind of role that this power structure, what that looks like in terms of privatization, displacement, effects of gentrification, and the degree to which cities, are transformed into the image of those of the elites of cities themselves, and the ways in which that excludes other populations from participating in what cities should look like. So the right to the city, as an idea, has like an explicitly kind of, it comes out of an explicitly Marxist tradition, and so it has a different kind of valence with respect to civil rights. That is, oftentimes civil rights, the way we think about them most often, is protections for minorities from the tyranny of the majority, majoritarian tyranny being the kind of threat. But of course, the right to the city idea, I think it puts right out in front that there's other tyrannies out there. There's the tyranny of the unregulated marketplace. There's the tyranny of a 1%, there's a tyranny of real estate, and that those ought to be central in how we think about transit as well. Another way to think about the kind of right to the city, and this is an idea that I've explored in other places, is a right against urban idiocy. And it's kind of I really like it. I don't know how, it doesn't really roll off the tongue, but it's an idea that kind of, it's a play on kind of what Marx and Engels wrote about in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, when they talked about the idiocy of rural life, the kind of privatized isolation of living in rural areas. And the argument that I have been making is that there's also an idiocy of urban life, that urban life can be inherently isolating and depoliticized. And so the right to the city is about kind of rejecting that reality. So the bulk of the book is spent kind of arguing for this like latter kind of component of placing the right to the city centrally in how we think about struggles over public transportation. And it does that in 4 chapters. And I was explicitly instructed not to go from chapter to chapter explaining what I say, because you can buy the book. And it might be, I don't want to be tedious, so I won't do that. But what I will say is go back to my kind of original point, which was that I think even given the lag time from when I did the research, that the arguments I'm advancing are more relevant now than I think they would have been 3 to 4 years ago. And I want to explain kind of why, which is one of the reasons I thought, and this is a pretty this just came across my Facebook feed, which was, it's just kind of this idea of labor's new militancy and the potential for transit labor to be part of that. So chapter 3 of the book, it basically gives a history of the Amalgamated Transit Union Local 192. And it focuses on a number of their big actions, one of which was the general strike of 1946, in which Carmen Al Brown, stopped his streetcar and shut down the entire city. So there was recently Oakland teachers strike, if you were paying attention. And AC Transit drivers refused to operate at schools. They refused to cross the picket line. And I was like, wow, this is I was just thinking about this. I was just reading this. I was just, this, it felt very wow, the book offers some sort of explanation for why they might do that, or for what the kind of energy behind that sort of action. There's a second point where I think it's relevant is the kind of new forms of transportation that are showing up in cities. Uber, Lyft, all the scooters, and the kind of need for a way to make sense of it all, and a way to make sense of it all critically. And I think a right to the city frame moves us in that direction. And there's many instances in the book where I kind of motion, although not explicitly, to how we might think about those things. And the last thing, and then I'll stop talking, is the kind of questions of the environment and the Green New Deal, and the degree to which kind of the fight against climate change will obviously require massive investments in alternative forms of transportation. The private car is killing the planet. And so, and there's a sense that transit there will need to be direct investments in buses, trains, all sorts of collective modes of transportation. And how we understand those investments is important. Are we creating transit-oriented developments that are like gated communities, or are we creating something else? So all those debates, I think, require us to think about transit in new and different ways, and that's part of what the book is about. And they also require us to think about rights and the rights to transit and in new and important ways. And so I think the book does that as well. So, buy the book, then you can send me an email and we can talk about it, because I'm pretty accessible. So, good, thanks.
Can everyone hear me, or should I also use the mic?
Use the mic.
Oh, hello. Okay, great. So before we get started, this is a good time to be studying transport. I was telling Professor Attoh to have all of you here. I mean, obviously he's a very popular professor and a great guy and all those things, but this is incredible for a book about right to the city and transit. So it's funny, as a professor, often when I am grading a paper, the first thing I do is I try to restate what the student wrote in their paper. And he said there are 3 parts of his book. I have, at the end of chapter 1, 3 bullets. Rights matter. Moral concern, in parentheses. 2, types of rights matter. And then 3, transport is tied up with other rights. So just, he's not lying. It comes across very clearly. And it really is a very wonderful book. As someone who has been studying transport for a while, I have a PhD in urban planning, and I wrote my dissertation about transportation planning in New York. And I do a lot of stuff related to transport planning. And ever since I sort of got into it, I have been trying to find a way to talk about certain things, such as rights and equity and justice, and have really struggled. It's very hard within the canon to break out of certain types of ways of writing and thinking, and it's mainly about the movement of stuff, just to sort of generalize. It's not about rights. It's not about access to to the city. It's not about those things, really. And I know in most everything I ever write, I always try to include a sentence that essentially says, these services or whatever allow you to access the promise of the city, which is, jobs and opportunity and so on and so forth. And as I was telling Kafui earlier today, one of the great things about reading is that when you come across a book that says the things you've been trying to say in sort of just a much more coherent way, that's how you know it's a good book. You're kind of like, oh yeah, that's what I've been trying to say for all this time, and just haven't quite found the words, but those ideas have been rattling in my head. So for all of those reasons, the book is wonderful. I got it a few weeks ago, and I sort of sat down and tore through it because so much of it are things that I want to say. The quote from Karen, excuse me. So I'm writing something right now about buses and whatever, and I really want to quote that quote. I've quoted him instead, but it's like that sentiment is exactly right. And I think the thing about transport that is so interesting is that it makes all the other rights meaningful, right? So what we talk about is without being able to get to things, you won't be excluded, you won't be isolated. Without the transport, though, you are alone. And I think the idea of the idiocy of urban life, and what he didn't tell you is that idiocy does not mean stupid. It means isolated in this context. I mean, he explained it clearly otherwise. And I think in New York, you see it so clearly. And I think if you look at sort of the history of people writing about cities, from Weber to Michael Sorkin or whatever, they get at this exact idea, the isolation of being in the city. There's that great book, Notes from Underground, that's the one, the Russian guy. And the whole book is about how he never really gets to interact with people. No one knows his name. No one ever says his name in the book. And I think one of the things in New York you see is that same sort of struggle that people have to connect with one another. And so many people go a full day without ever speaking to each other. And that, at least for me, it seems very sad. And I think that transport is one of those enabling services that allows all of that to happen. I think in my role, I more have just like some questions, and I'd rather talk to Professor Attoh than talk at you. I'd love to talk to you. So do you mind if I ask you some questions?
Yep, go ahead. I mean,
Great.
yes.
Right. So the first thing is sort of how did you get into all of this? So your background is in geography. I'm from New York. I've been riding the subway and buses since I was a little kid. I'm like obsessed with these things. How did you get into all of this?
I wasn't prepared to answer that, but that's a good question. So actually, as I mentioned in the preface, I had done a master's thesis on transit in Syracuse, and part of the reason I think I chose to do it was it seemed like a good way to get to know the city. I had just come out of undergrad. I actually didn't have a driver's license. I'm not from New York. I'm from a place where generally young people do get driver's license, but I didn't have one, and so I was taking the bus everywhere, and it just seemed like, oh, this is interesting, and it connects to all sorts of other things I'm interested in. So why not study it? Why not think critically about it? So it's probably it.
And have you just sort of stayed with it? And because I mean, one of the things that comes up in the book is he interviews a lot of professionals, and there's a lot of very technical stuff that happens. And I'm sort of like, how did you make sense of some of these things? Like there's one example in particular, and I apologize for getting into these details, but he's interviewing a senior planner at AC Transit about a specific bus, and it's talking about, we have 4 buses an hour, 30-minute headways. Like, how do you get into that world? Like, understanding all that different stuff is just reading on the side. Did you? I don't know. Is Don Mitchell a great transit nerd?
Not really.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
But he, something that comes out in the book is that a lot of the interviews were just, I'm really interested in transit. Just talk to me, and kind of just talk to me about how the system works, mm-hmm. and how does why is it so shitty? You know, why am I why are there 3 buses in a row? You know, why does that happen? It's called bus bunching, and so they
Accurate.
and so the kind of just figuring out, well, you know, how are people thinking about it, and so yeah, just curiosity, just simple curiosity about, you know, how something works. Now the transit world is unique in that I think it kind of cultivates a certain kind of person. So there's in the East Bay there was the East Bay bus fans, and it was one of the members was it's actually, his name is Ron Hook, and he became like a tremendous resource for me because he's just so into buses. And with this group, they would do bus spotting. So they would hang out on corners and just kind of watch buses go by. When when they were closing a garage in Emeryville, and so the bus fans all got together and they just went through all the files. They started they took a picture of the last bus leaving the garage. There was just a community of people that were really into it. Like, they knew all the different types of bus models. They knew the engine types. Ron Hook, he invited me over to his house because he had timetables from the 1950s to the 1990s. That is, schedules for each issue, and he had filing cabinets of schedules. He had a bus engine in his backyard. He was just so into it, and I'm not that into it, but I was into it that he was into it, and so it was just this is just absolutely fascinating. And I, just talking to him about, at some point I wanted to do a study on, all right, so how long would it take to get from Emeryville in the East Bay to the MacArthur Station BART in 1960? How long would it take to get to in 1970? And the only way I could figure that out was to find the timetables, because they're not posted. And I was talking to him about this project, and he had all this extra information in his head about, well, you can start here, just look in my file cabinet and we'll pull out the timesheets together. And it's just, I don't know, transit, it's a whole world. it's a whole world, and it's a really interesting world. That there was a story of that guy who drives the subway, who steals the buses and steals the trains. Yeah, it's like, so I think as a researcher, when you stumble upon an entire world that you didn't know existed, then it's like, wow, and you just want to be there. You just want to hang out there and map it. And so that's a long answer to the kind of.
No, that's a perfect answer. It's true. Transit fans are a unique breed. I'm sort of curious though. Did you ever talk to Ron Hook and others about your ideas about right to the city and some of these more abstract ideas? Because at least in my experience, transit fans tend to be extremely narrowly focused. They care more about the hum of an engine than some of these other things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think I tried with Ron, but I think his eyes just glazed over because he's like, but the timetables, but what the kind of all the kind of theoretical conceptual stuff. That was exciting for other geographers and scholars, whereas a lot of transit planners, what they really want, and this is fine, is for the bus system to work and for it to be efficient and for to make sure that the system maintains the headways that it's supposed to maintain and increasing ridership and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So once you start talking about the idiocy of urban life and the right to the city and autogestion and all this highfalutin French theory, not only do you lose them, but you lose a lot of other people too.
So one quick aside, because I actually want to follow up on that exact point. There is a lot of good French stuff in the book. I am personally a Francophile, so I was very heartened to read it. I read a lot of transport stuff, rarely get this kind of, so much Lefebvre and other things. But sort of building off of your point, so as many of you might know, the city council speaker, Corey Johnson, yesterday, or whatever, a few days ago, I don't remember what day it was, in his State of the City address, spoke for basically 50 minutes uninterrupted about transit and this idea that the city of New York should take over the transit system. And one of the things that is interesting about the way he framed his talk was very much in the way that you've framed your pitch for transport being the right or the thing that makes everything else sort of possible and of value. I mean, he doesn't talk about right to the city explicitly, obviously, but he makes the argument that, you know, if the city doesn't have sort of control over its subways and buses, and we allow the state to sort of do whatever it's been doing, our transportation system is going to fall apart, and New Yorkers will, you know, bear the brunt of those consequences. So, I mean, you know, you've mentioned, right, 3 years later, you think you're doing well in talking about TODs and Uber and so on and so forth, but this is something that was announced, you know, days ago, and it's in the exact same sort of frame that you're sort of talking about. I don't know, did you follow his talk at all? Do you know anything about it?
I read a brief article on it, and I was trying to remember the name of the transit system, BAT that it would be. You know, I think the devil's in the details. So
it's very detailed, surprising. But yes.
Okay,
sorry.
but then I would have to I'd have to look at it. But yeah, I think. So, New York is a special case, you know, and you know, in terms of transit.
That's what we like to say.
Well, it just the ridership numbers, the size of the system, the degree to which, you know, the kind of proportion of people in the city who use transit as opposed to anywhere else in the country. I mean, it just leaps and bounds beyond. I mean, I think the closest, there's Chicago, there's Washington, D.C., but they're not even close. It's something like 1 out of every, maybe you have the number, like 7 trips or.
So 62% of all New Yorkers commute to work via transit.
Right.
So that's, you know, first of all, otherworldly in terms of the city of New York, the country. Other parts of the world actually do compete with New York in terms of its sort of transit dependence, but yes.
But yeah, it's so within in the context of the U.S., New York is just a case apart, and so it's just. And I'm kind of dipping my toe into it, you know, but I think I need to think a bit more. A lot of the examples, you know, I pull from are from, you know, obviously the East Bay, but also San Francisco, where, you know, transit ridership is you know, as a city is quite high. It's just nothing like here, and the politics are just not as I would say intense. Yeah, so it's a good question, but we'll have to. I mean, the congestion pricing issue as well, you know, is now something to think about. But yeah, let me get back to you. We'll have a homework assignment.
Well, I don't know. I'm not an ambassador for the transport community, but I certainly welcome you to talk about these things. So a few other things that were of special interest to me. So I think it's the 3rd chapter, you sort of close out with this example from Parkchester and this unification of labor and transit riders. And I wanted to thinking more about that is just something to talk about. I myself have done quite a bit of work with the Transportation Workers Union Local 100 here in New York about buses. And one of the examples that you bring up, though, is that there was this area, Parkchester. I don't know anything about the Bay Area, so pardon me if I get it all wrong. But they basically didn't have bus service. It was primarily a black neighborhood, and it was the bus operators who were like, "Hey, we live in Parkchester. We need service in Parkchester." to me, I read it as an example of sort of like a unification of publics, sort of, well, I won't get too deeply into that right now. But one of the things in New York is that a lot of our operators don't live in the city. And so there's this sort of divergence between publics of the public that the bus operators belong to and the public that transit riders belong to. And I'm sort of curious if you came across any more of those things. I think finding a way to bring labor and riders together is really powerful. And the TWU Local 100 here in New York, they're trying in lots of ways because, the bus is going the way of an autonomous vehicle, and they recognize that that is a threat to labor, but also bus ridership is just declining dramatically in New York, which is also a threat to labor. So they're trying to figure out ways in which what's good for them is also good for the riders.
Yeah, so the Parchester example is a really good one. So it actually, I learned this when I was interviewing Claudia Hudson, who is no longer, I think she's at the International. Edouard is.
She just retired.
She just retired. Okay.
Yeah.
So so I was interviewing Claudia Hudson, and this was in the aftermath of there was a big contract fight. It was both around pensions. I think there was something around bathroom breaks, and there was a slowdown, and so there was tensions brewing between kind of the ridership. I think the tensions were exploited by the Oakland Tribune, but nascent tensions between the ridership and the driver and the drivers union. And so she was saying, I was saying, how do you think about that? How do you reconcile that? And her response was, the drivers and the riders, we're the same. We're part of the same working class community. And then she gave the example of the Parchester story, in which what had been a kind of solidly middle-class black community that lacked transit, once black drivers started entering the workforce at AC Transit really heavily in the 1960s and 1970s, after a bunch of lawsuits about a kind of diversity in the workforce, they immediately advocated for integrating this neighbor into the wider system. And I love it because it matches with what kind of my politics and what I kind of want to say, and the narrative I want to offer about kind of the potential for labor and community groups to fight for equity and justice in the city. But I think you're right. There's so another thing about me, I live in Poughkeepsie, so so I commute down, and oftentimes if I take the early commute, there are many people in MTA uniforms taking the trains down with me, just because it's more affordable where I can live. They could potentially buy a house, raise a family, and so but that's where they have been shoved off to, and so. But I think that's also a potential because, that is their experience of being priced out of New York City becomes fodder for something else, for a politics that engages those types of issues, which connects kind of transit access with housing affordability. So I guess it's all depends on how it's narrated.
Sure. Okay, so. Towards the end of the book, you have a chapter about alternatives, and you're talking about transportation-oriented development and sort of the vanguard in 2010 of what's going on. The book is silent on sort of the newfangled things. So if you're really into Uber or you're really into scooters or bicycles, the book does not explicitly address those things. So I think it's a good time to have you address if you've thought about these things more directly. What do you make of the rise of sort of new forms of mobility and there's huge labor implications, obviously, but sort of just our cities, not this one in particular, have been sort of flooded with these new alternatives that maybe compete with transit, maybe compete with driving, maybe compete with walking, and sort of how do we sort of make sense of all of this?
So this is, it's these are actually things I've been thinking about a lot, partly because I've been doing a project on Uber in the Washington, D.C. area. So I think there are a number of ways to think about it. So there was the kind of famous UC Davis study on kind of the impact of kind of ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft on public transit ridership, and they did find that, there was in a select number of cities a kind of a skimming of transit riders into kind of private automobiles, which I think from an environmental perspective is bad. So, but I also think it does not portend well for kind of the claims that many of these agencies are making, oftentimes in the language of, we're providing last mile service, which is we're actually increasing transit's accessibility, because places like DC, places like San Francisco, where you have kind of post-1950 heavy rail, where kind of stops are far apart that aren't easily walkable to. Having Uber there provides you the ability to go from your home directly to BART. But I think the evidence for that is questionable, and I really question the kind of motives of those kind of large-scale companies, even though the kind of rhetoric around public transit has been very good. In fact, it's been like you can tell it's been workshopped multiple times. The question of scooters, Doe Lee is here, electric bikes. I mean, I think that's all. I'd have to think more about that. But there's nothing. The technology itself is amazing. The convenience of it is absolutely amazing. So that is both something to recognize, but also something to be skeptical of, because too often we learn that the convenience. I was just listening to a program about Amazon and the kind of carbon footprint that the kind of Amazon package, just having this tiny little book delivered to your house, has on the environment. So it's so convenient, but I think that means we have to, question it a bit.
Has anyone here read the book? Are we taking questions? Is that a thing that we're doing? Or because I have actually a couple more questions, but I don't want to take up time if other people have questions. Okay. Well, I'll be quiet.
So there's a microphone here.
My name is Andrew Kurzweil. I'm a transit advocate. And I've been finding, at least in New York City, and we've been dealing with this Uber thing since before Uber, in regards to plain simple thing called dollar vans and everything. And I'm like seeing how dollar vans began because certain neighborhoods weren't getting proper bus service and everything, so we came up, and then what happened, because of the dollar vans, cut down, it wound up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's what we're seeing here with the Uber and Lyft now. It's becoming more and more and more, and this has got to stop somewhere, because plain and simple, we're all going to wind up. So my question is, how do we get everybody to get along on this? Because it's just not, how do we stop this vicious cycle?
Take a couple more.
Okay, so I've been doing a study on my own as a designer and as an observer of New York City in terms of bicycles, bike lanes, and obeying the law put down, and you could get into chaos. So my basic premise, and I'm wondering whether you agree with me, I think you do, in a city of 8.5 million people, pedestrians rule. Everything is done from the pedestrian's point of view. You made a very important point in terms of there's tyranny of the majority and there's tyranny of the minority based on a simple thing of power. So how much do you agree with me, I hope you agree a lot, that all the laws, all the procedures, all the programs should be based on the fact that the pedestrian rules. If you are ambulatory, you have free movement. So when it comes to, you never see a sign saying yield to cars. You always see a sign saying yield to pedestrians. And a lot of the things that are happening, I mean, I've stood on corners and just watched how many bikes go through the red light, how many bikes are traveling in the wrong direction. And whenever a new bike lane comes in, sidewalks, I mean, anecdotes and anecdotes. And I've been working on it for years. I've never gotten the wherewithal to put it down in an article or something like that. So the basic foundation, my background as an architect, the basic foundation of the whole building of the city is based on a good foundation. And the pedestrian rule is a good foundation to start with. Everything comes from that. What's your...
I'm going to help you out on the transportation.
Yeah.
point, the first transportation point.
So this is an expert on dollar vans.
The first thing I'd say is that all modes of transport sort of come to exist to solve some sort of a problem, right? And so dollar vans, as were mentioned in the first case, were a response to often a lack of taxis in a bunch of neighborhoods in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and also sort of undependable, slow buses. And so the first thing that I always try to say is the way we need to think about dollar vans is not as good or bad, but it's the response to a problem. Like, people from Jamaica and Haiti didn't just jump into vans to start moving up and down Flatbush Avenue because they like to do that. I don't think that's why. And people I've spoken to, they didn't tell me that. It was that there was an opportunity because the system that exists was inadequate. And so if any of you have ever looked at a bus map, the bus is everywhere. It's not for a lack of not being places. It's just we have sort of like inadequate access to just decent service. And so, in Manhattan, you don't see the vans. There is one van, but let's just pretend that doesn't exist for the time being. And that's because that seems important.
And
I was saying, there's sort of inadequate access to decent service. And in Manhattan, right, we have this sort of ubiquitous subway. And so the need for alternatives is much less strong, although we still do need them. That's why you have bikes and taxis and all these other things. So I think that the answer to the dollar van issue, right, is that you need to have sort of high frequency buses that are reliable and dependable, and that people know, okay, if I get on this bus at 9 o'clock, I will get to my job at 9:30, or I could get to school at 9:30, and the window is very small. One, not to get too deep into this, but I was able to use some bus time data and timing dollar van rides on Flatbush Avenue, and what I found was, on average, I'm going to use some weird percentages because it's like statistics stuff, but 68% of B41 buses going to or from Kings Plaza on Flatbush Avenue take about an hour end to end. And this is to Smith and Livingston Street, not to Cadman Plaza in downtown, with a standard deviation of 15 minutes, meaning that 70% of the time, your bus is going to be either take 45 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes, right? That's a big window of uncertainty. While a dollar van, on the other hand, is going to take you 45 minutes with a window of a standard deviation of 5 minutes. So 70% of the time, your dollar van will either be 40 minutes or 50 minutes. Or, well, I'm sorry, between 40 minutes and 50 minutes. It won't be one or the other. And so that much smaller uncertainty is what people are paying for. Many of the people who ride dollar vans have unlimited Metro cards. For those that don't know, dollar vans don't go anywhere the B41 bus doesn't go. It's exactly the same. It's just much faster, more reliable, and you get a seat. Some people will tell you it's very dangerous. I'm not going to comment on that right now. To your point about the vicious cycle, yes, they'll keep cutting as long as people are migrating away. And the B41 bus is the biggest loser in Brooklyn in terms of ridership. It really is very sad. The TWU is running a Restore the B41 campaign. Just I'll plug it. But the answer is not to demonize the vans. It's to say, okay, we need to get our act together. We need to provide a level of service that is going to sort of obviate the need for this alternative. And there are ways to do that. You could put a bus lane, for instance, on Flatbush Avenue. Some people are very against that. Some people are very in favor of it. You can look at stop spacing for the bus. Sometimes that's controversial, I know. But these are the conversations that we need to start having about our surface transport. In New York, for generations, has not had any kind of surface transport policy. So I took that one.
Yeah, what was the second question? I don't know. I hate a situation in which, and I don't know if you were doing this. I'm just implying it from the kind of comments you made, where we're pitting bicyclists against pedestrians. Partly because I think we should be on the same team fighting private cars. So, I think I am for all sorts of kind of alternative forms of transit. Now, there are ways we can, increase safety, make sure that kind of, the issue, of course, is that, there are very few there are more cases in which people are injured by cars than by people riding a bike. It's I don't have the data, but it's
Also the severity.
the severity of the injury is just there's nothing. So I take your point, the idea of pedestrians ruling. I would actually switch it because I think there's not pedestrians, but I think there's I kind of want to point to Do Lee here on this one, but because he's been doing a lot of work on electric bikes, and he's been framing it as a labor issue, which it is, and the kind of rights of the rights of laborers to work and to do work well, and I it's hard for me to disagree with that. So actually, I'm not sure I'm on board. Yeah, we'll talk after.
I'm a victim of being hit by bikes on the sidewalk. I live right off of Flatbush Avenue. You can't get buses. The dollar vans drive wherever they want, however they want. Bicyclists don't care. They don't stop. They don't look. We have had more hit and runs in my neighborhood lately than I can't even dream about. It's like, and King's Plaza is right there, and they don't do anything. In fact, I can walk to the bus terminal. That's right there too, and they do nothing. They don't care.
So that's obviously very unfortunate, and I'm sorry to hear that you were hit by a bicyclist. King's Plaza, this is going to be very detailed. I really am very sorry. But the sort of the geometry and the design of that area is awful. I mean, it is essentially a speedway, multiple lanes of traffic, a median is very wide crossing the street there. So you have lots of cars going at a much higher speed. And so I think just like through design, there are good ways to sort of tame and sort of calm what's going on there to make it a more hospitable environment. I think that's what's really missing out in some of the far reaches of the city, and King's Plaza definitely being one of those reaches. So I think the answer there, and I think the answer actually to other things that come up in this book, to bring it back, Professor Attoh is critical of transit-oriented development because of the sort of effects it has on gentrification and the sort of lack of people getting rid of cars. But the problem, the way at least I see it, is one of design, right? So if you design housing that has parking, people are going to have cars. If you design transit-oriented development the way they do in a lot of Manhattan where they don't build parking, well, you don't give people that option. And so it can, that adds costs, so you need to then sell it or rent it to someone of higher income. They need to then have a car. So all these things sort of like build upon each other. And so I think in the case of Kings Plaza, the place of TOD, problems have a lot to do with design and sort of what our priorities and principles are. So I think that's sort of what we need to be thinking about.
Changing gears a little bit.
I'm curious about the role of transit oriented development. I'm kind of reframing my question real time here because you just made a point that kind of negates my contrarian question. But I guess I'm asking, like, as cities become ensconced in a global network of like Western cities, right, whereby Paris is more like, New York is more like Paris than it is like Des Moines, say. Like, at what point does city life become based on a right to consumption, and at what point does a more equitable transit system only facilitate more and more consumption that has obvious colonial, gendered, and racial implications?
Yeah, so question is kind of. Wherever you are. Yeah, I think it's a good question in terms of question of global cities, I guess, is what you're talking about, but also kind of the transit policies in global cities. Eric is probably a good person to think about Paris because you spend so much time there. But I think in terms of the question of consumption, in terms of what is transit for, I guess. I think there's a lot of the book kind of emphasizes, to the degree that it talks about what transit is for, transit's relationship to access to a democratic public life, which is not consumption-based, but not production-based. It's kind of the right to be part of the city, to access those areas of the city in which you can engage in politics. So I guess I think there's a kind of, I guess I would want to know kind of some examples of what exactly you're talking about, because I think there's like the situation in this is a good example. So in Poughkeepsie, where I live, there is something called the Shopper Special. Okay, and they give it a name. This is what you're supposed to do with transit. It's actually a pretty good line. Then there's also, most of the other lines, the most frequent lines are ones that go to the mall and back. Now you could say, well, that's more or less about consumption. I guess they're taking people to shopping. But if you actually go on the buses, it's the workers. The people who are using the buses are people going to work in consumptive industries, because that's where the economy has gone in Poughkeepsie. It's a service sector economy, and so public transit is going to places that people have to work. So, and I think that's fine.
So I think picking up on a point you made earlier, when Professor Attoh is looking at the APTA website, which I know he does on most Friday nights. So the APTA website is the American Public Transportation Association website. A lot of the studies are about, how does building light rail or building subways increase property values? If you follow transportation debates currently, one of the vogues is build a 1 mile light rail to revitalize your downtown or revitalize a dilapidated part of your city. Detroit recently opened up its 1 mile light rail, just right on cue. So I think a lot of it is that the system we live in is one that is dominated by sort of capitalism, and so a lot of the things that the public provides are meant to sort of serve those needs of landowners and things like that. So I think whatever we might want to say, the contemporary city is absolutely one that is about consumption. I'm not going to say, maybe first and foremost, but I think that one of the things about transit in particular is that while it does facilitate a lot of that stuff, sort of as Professor Attoh mentioned, there's a lot of space for other things to happen. And I think the thing that's always been attractive about transit, to me at least, is that there is this sort of transgressive thing going on. Even though, right, like the 4, 5, and 6 train moves over 2 million people a day, and is sort of the buildings on top of it in certain parts of the city are the most valuable. It is taking people all over the city. It is sort of iconic for being, bombed with graffiti in the 80s. It takes you to a Yankee game. I know it's consumption, but sports are cool, at least to me. And it also does provide access to opportunity and all kinds of other things. So transport is not just like easily in one category or another. It sort of crosses so many things, and it makes it such a great topic to study. Just to push that one more time.
Fitzroy.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to comment on Eric's point earlier with regards to several things about commuter vans. So there's also a rich history that goes back to the Caribbean. So a lot of those van drivers, because there was no formalized bus system, they established those commuter van systems in places like Jamaica, St. Vincent, all over the Caribbean, and then they brought those systems over here. Now, with regards to the B41, right? Now we're getting into the territory of my work a little bit. There's another component besides just like the amount of time, and this is something that I've noticed. There's a disconnect between the developers of transportation systems and the Department of Transportation, and there's not a fair integration. If you look along Flatbush Avenue, there's miles on end where you cannot make a turn off until a side street until you get closer to downtown, and that also leads to the congestion. But so my question, bringing it back to the book now, is an issue of capacity, because right now, being an avid transit rider, the system is at full capacity. There's hardly a time where you cannot get on the train without being squished. Or even certain buses like the B46 in Brooklyn, which has the second largest ridership in the city. So my question is twofold. One, in this, as we start to as the city continues to expand, because there's going to be a point where it becomes a 20 million person city rather than a 8.5 million person city. What rights would then have to be important? Would transportation, would the public system's rights then supersede those who seek alternative means, whether it's using bicycles or just automobiles or whatever the next mode of transportation is. And then the second thing is how do we create better synergy between the Department of Transportation and the MTA to alleviate some of the problems on both ends?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's a good one. In terms of, so the examples I have are in the Bay Area. So, one of the MTC, which is what it's called in the San Francisco Bay Area, is kind of the regional planning organization for the entire 9 counties, I believe. And so it has a kind of, it has a kind of, has a view at 30,000 feet. And so it's one of the kind of things it routinely does is create regional transportation plans, which are aimed to predict where economic growth is going to be, and therefore where you're supposed to put in transit lines, or, you know, it has a view of the kind of totality of the system so that it can address, you know, kind of some of the issues we're facing, whether the city is growing or whether the city is shrinking. And where it's growing, it's focused on that. So that is always a contentious, at least in the Bay Area, a contentious process, because it's dealing with kind of how money is going to be allocated, what sort of modes are going to be. Are we going to extend the BART? Are we going to extend AC Transit? Are we going to extend Samtrans? If we extend Samtrans, then we have to cut back on Caltrain. If we cut back on Caltrain, you know, it goes on and on and on. And I think you could probably say the same thing about New York, and to the degree that there are so many different types of transit agencies that require some degree of coordination. You know, one of the things that was great about the Bay Area when I was there was they introduced a kind of a way to transfer between the Clipper card, where you could transfer between different, you know, transit agencies without having to, you know, be like, oh, so where's my BART card? Or where's my AC Transit card? And so, in retrospect, when, you know, when they introduced it, you're like, why is it 2010 that they're doing this? It seems like something that, you know, they would have introduced much earlier. The other question, I you know, I don't know, but maybe in terms of the kind of details of that and the relationship between MTA and.
So the relationship between the MTA and DOT is vitally important, especially for buses. So for those that don't know, MTA owns the buses. They decide on the service and all that good stuff, but it's the DOT that controls the streets. And so if you want to get a bus lane put in, the DOT has to be the one to do it. It's not the MTA. And so talking about the SBS 46, for instance, or the 44, this is Utica Avenue and then in Bedford and Ostrand. These are our select bus services where it's a joint agreement between the two. So the DOT has striped those lanes and they've agreed to put the bus stops where they put them, and the MTA provides the service. There is talk potentially, and I haven't actually read through all of the Corey Johnson plan. I'm halfway through, but I think one of the things that is proposed is sort of a unification of these two things. And I think that would potentially go a long way to resolving some of these issues. But not necessarily. Like the MTA, as you probably know, is you have New York City Transit, which is buses and subways, plus MTA bus and maps, other things. But then you have Metro North and Long Island Railroad, and these things do not really communicate easily with one another. You know, the idea of this metro-wide MTC in San Francisco, or what you have in pretty much every single European city, where suburbs and city really are connected with one payment card, one fare, or one sensible fare. We don't have that in New York, right? So even if you live in Brooklyn or you live in Queens and you want to take Long Island Railroad into the city, sometimes you can do it from the Brooklyn side. On the weekends, you can do it in Queens. But, you know, all those people who live in Jamaica don't get the benefit, essentially, of Long Island Railroad unless they're willing to pay up for it. And even Metro North and Long Island Railroad don't get along. I don't know if anyone here is following sort of what's going on at Grand Central Station. But Grand Central Station has tons of train tracks and berths. But because Metro North and Long Island Railroad don't get along, Long Island Railroad is building a tunnel underneath Grand Central. What? Okay, that's not the reason according to you. All right, no, I don't think it's a question. I'll retract that last part. All I will say is that, you know, just because it's one agency doesn't mean that everyone gets along. But I think it would be a move in the right direction.
I was just going to say, so just one quick and then we'll go to, we're going to wrap up in about 5 to 10 minutes, so we'll take 1, 2 questions, a couple questions, and if anyone has any last questions.
Yeah, I was very interested in what you said about the Climber card, or London, they've got the Oyster card, New York, we don't have regional rail yet because we have different railroads. The genesis of it is we had different railroads initially many years ago when they were privatized. Now, of course, the government basically owns the state, and the different systems. And we have nice on Nassau County, which used to be MTA, but now it's privatized, and people would say it was much worse. I don't know. It's a lot of ticket. I don't know if that's true or not, but what can we do? I mean, if you get a regional rail, do you have any ideas?
It's so you need an MPO type entity.
We have that.
Yeah,
Called
we do.
Intech.
But to do it, I mean, that's the route to go.
You get an RPA, but take a suggestion.
Yeah, but I think that's.
But Intech just had their meeting like two days ago, I think it was, and the big thing about that yearly meeting was small mobility and like, we gotta figure this out. And they are the ones who do the bulk of funding, and they do exactly what you were mentioning on the West Coast. Yeah. But the DOT and like MTA, the funding is from the similar pot, USDOT, FTA. So you're like I'm from Nassau County,
We
so.
don't get much federal funding. In New York, most of our funding, unless it's a big project.
FTA does like 80%, and then statewide is 10.
No, not New York. New York, we get a lot of state and a little bit of federal. Unless it's a big project on Second Avenue or East Side Access.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on Long Island, so I'm talking about our buses.
Oh, but your
and
bus
stuff.
is maybe
So,
different.
no, buses
I don't
in
know.
general.
Yeah.
Yeah. Stop, I'm sorry.
Maybe one more question? Two more questions? Yeah, you're in.
Good evening. My name is Marky Wolford. I was an executive board member of Local 100. I've used different systems across the country and the world. They all have one thing in common. They're all pretty much messed up in different ways, well, basically the same ways. What I yet to try to figure out is, you probably may have more experience, familiar with BART and Marron, and I just came from DC, forgot what they call. But what is the common denominator in all of this? Transit, public transportation, boondoggle. It's really, it's very the lifeblood of every city, especially New York. New York wouldn't have grown as strong and vibrant as it is now if we didn't have a reliable public transportation system. 41, yeah, I use that. I use that a lot myself. But at the end of the day, when compared to other systems in the country, and I live in Jersey now, compared to that, I'd rather take the 41 than some of those other buses over there. But I'm trying to figure out what is the common denominator of all the cities and their public transportation problems, and I can't come to a very concise answer to that question.
We'll take one more.
Hi, Chris Fox. I've been in the industry for railroad for like 25 years. Former motor New York City Transit, current locomotive engineer from Metro North. So my question is, in recent events, they're opening up new stations in the Bronx next several years, Parkchester, Hunts Point, Club City, and there's also a possibility of revitalization of a station in Queens with Long Island Railroad. Would that be assisting transportation in general for areas that are bus related? That you have areas that are still potentially rail operated, not New York City Transit, other railroads. How do you feel about that?
So the first question, which is not an easy question, but the first place I'd go is, a lot of what makes transit good and efficient is well known. Like we know a lot about how to make transit systems better. What we need is two things: political will and force behind to get those things done, and then money. So, and they're connected. So, I mean, and I'm not sure. I mean, there's probably that's a very broad answer, but the kind of what's exciting, I think, about some of the stuff in the book is that there are examples of people organizing around transit to advance a more efficient system, and to get money, to redirect money toward transit in ways that work. So I don't really, I had a very good experience in Mexico City recently with the Metro bus system and their subway. I'm sure if you ask someone from Mexico, they'd basically say the same thing. This is crap. But I thought it was really great, and I was really impressed with it. So it was 5 pesos, which it's so accessible. So. But on the other question, Eric, do you want to take that one?
So I mean, I think the question of, how do we get people to, the common denominator issue, I think historically what you see is a crisis emerges and then people start to pay attention. I think transportation is very easy to put on the back burner until there's a problem. I was watching the Public Advocate's second debate a few weeks ago. If anyone else was watching it, I'm sure someone was. And Melissa Mark Viverito, who did not win, she said we have 2 crises in New York. One is about affordability, affordable housing. The other is about transport. Having grown up in New York and been obsessed with local politics, it was sort of the first time since I wasn't alive in the late 70s, and I was alive in the early 80s, but that it had been sort of the key issue. Historically, it's always been safety and education, and to hear sort of transport nudging its way to the top is, I think, suggestive and is something that, we will see movement on it. And I think a lot of what Corey Johnson is doing, whether misguided or not, great or not, is he's tapped into this very palpable frustration that New Yorkers have with their transit system. In terms of the second question, and someone else was mentioning regional rail, you mentioned it as well, and I think these new stations in the Bronx and Queens are all to the good. I think, we didn't really talk too much about congestion pricing. It seems to be something that is likely to happen in some form. I don't think that Queens elected officials will go for it unless they do get some real transit improvements, sort of this Atlantic ticket, freedom ticket, whatever you want to call it, some sort of fare integration on Long Island Railroad, and that's what they're trying to do in the Bronx as well. I think I have a lot of thoughts about regional rail. I will not get into it unless you want to talk to me afterwards. But it is a big thing that we are missing in New York, and really distinguishes us in a very bad way from cities around the world, I would say.
Great, thanks.